We are visiting today with Bengt Danielsson, the anthropologist that came to Tahiti aboard the Kon Tiki in 1947. Could you tell us, Ben, about your first thought of the idea of coming down to Tahiti on a raft called the Kon Tiki?
It so happened that the whole expedition was planned for 6 men, and the Norwegians were only 5. And they had equipment and food for 6. So I said, why don't you come along? And I joined them. We left on the 28th of April. Our raft was about 45 feet long and 18 feet wide. It had a double mast and a square sail, and we were supposed to be pushed by the currents and the winds. And this is exactly what happened. Of course, we had no previous experience of balsa rafts of this type. No other people had either. And most of the people who came down to the wharf before we left were quite skeptical. And I said, for instance, well, you know what will happen? The ropes will break and you will be sitting each one on a separate log right out in the middle of the ocean. And that's quite unpleasant. Or they said, you know, when there will sooner or later be a storm or a gale or a hurricane, and then the whole raft will capsize, turn upside down, and you will be on the wrong side. Well, to that we said, of course, the raft is equally flat on both sides, so all we have to do in that case is to climb back up on the right side, on the upper side of. And then I think that were most of the people were absolutely convinced that the raft was to become waterlogged in a few weeks. They said, you know, balsa wood absorbs water. It's very light wood. They use it for making these model airplanes. And certainly dry, light balsa wood absorbs much water, no doubt about that. But our raft was made of freshly cut logs.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I think we really didn't think of this. It just so happened, I mean, we tried to follow the sort of prehistoric model to make an exact replica of the prehistoric South American Indian rafts. And since we know for certain that they were marvelous seagoing craft, we said, well, we'll make an exact copy and we'll be on the safe side. But we didn't really think of this little detail of the logs, you know, that could get waterlogged. So we cut the logs just before we built the raft, and this meant that the logs were were full of sap. And then there was no room for any water. They couldn't sink, you know, deeper than they already were, you know, on the sea. So we soon discovered that the skeptics had been wrong and that we were completely right. We had no difficulties whatsoever. The raft behaved very well indeed, and it didn't even roll or pitch. Take a small yacht, small sailing boat, rolls and pitches terribly, whereas this big, and I say heavy raft, the total weight was something in the vicinity of 20 tons. It moved up and down, but very slowly, very gently. So for instance, when we had our meals on the deck, we could put down our glasses on the deck and they didn't fall over, which proves the point, I think. And the days passed, and we grew very well accustomed to this sort of life. And I think now in retrospect, the most wonderful thing was that we had a perfect peace. I mean, we were cut off from the rest of the world. We didn't see any ships at all. We forgot about all our previous worries. And we got along very well indeed. Often people have asked us after the trip, but didn't you, you know, become enemies? Didn't you have troubles and fights and so on? And that was certainly not the case. Here we had rather comfortable conditions on board. There's plenty of space. The raft didn't roll, as I said. We had plenty of food. So, I mean, this certainly contributed to the harmony that reigned on board. But another explanation is simply that these 5 Norwegian boys were very tough indeed. They had actually all fought in the Norwegian underground movement. They had suffered terribly in this fight against the German occupiers. And they have very fine characters indeed. We had another problem, another danger that none of us had ever thought of before we left Peru, and that was simply the speed of the raft. Well, we didn't make more than 1.8 knots on an average, and it varied very little. We rarely, well, I don't think we never, sailed faster than 2 knots. Well, and that's it's a very modest speed. It probably seemed to you and to most people. But nevertheless, it was much faster than our rubber dinghies could travel. We had 2 rubber dinghies, and we had believed very innocently before we set out that it would be possible to use these dinghies for making trips in all directions, go fishing and so on. But we soon discovered that the big heavy raft traveled much faster than the light rubber dinghies. And this meant, of course, that we could not go back and fetch anything that fell into the sea. So we said to say, what happens then if one of us falls into the sea? And in order to, let us say, take care of such an incident, we had a roll of rope at the end of the raft. The idea was that if one of us fell into the sea, well, the man who happened to be nearest was then to tie the rope around his waist, jump into the water and swim out and grab him. Well, it actually happened once. Well, everything happened according to the scenario, except for one thing, that the rope wasn't long enough. But the man, the lifesaver, the voluntary lifesaver, managed to grab the man at the last minute. And so from then on, we were much more careful.
I bet you caught all kind of fish out there.
Not so many different species of fish, certainly not. We had, sharks to begin with, but let's say we should start at the other end. We had to begin with on the logs a lot of seaweeds. Well, it started after a few weeks, but from then on, the logs were covered with the seaweeds and barnacles and small shells and so on. And then small fishes came to eat, the seaweed, bigger fishes came to eat the small fishes and so on. But there were not so many different species. There were some tuna fish, some bonitos, but they kept at a distance. On the other hand, we had mahi-mahi, the Pacific, wonderful, most delicious fish I know. And we had hundreds, if not thousands of them all around the raft. And they came right up to the raft to eat the seaweeds and the barnacles. So it was extremely easy to harpoon mahi-mahi. We could catch as many as we wanted, and we had, I think, fresh mahi-mahi, fried mahi-mahi every day. And then, of course, it was even easier to catch flying fish. They came on board by themselves during the night. It was enough to leave a lamp and they flew on board. So the first duty of the cook in the morning was to gather the flying fish and fry them for breakfast.
Didn't Mr. Thor Heyerdahl had a point to prove that Polynesian came from South America?
Let us put it this way, that the reason why he made this trip was because he had become interested in the problem of the origins of the Polynesians. But the immediate purpose of this trip was simply to prove that rafts are seaworthy. Since this trip, Thor Heyerdahl has continued his researches, has published many works where he has presented all the evidence for, shall we say, contacts between South America and Polynesia. The most famous proof of that is, of course, the sweet potato. And that is an American plant. It existed also in Polynesia in pre-European times, and the name for it is the same, kumara, kumala, and so on. So,
how did you felt when you first saw land?
We were a little bit sad because this was an atoll in the Tuamotu group, Puka Puka. And of course we wanted very badly to go all the way to Tahiti. We were already southwest of the atoll, so it was almost behind us, and we couldn't return against the wind. So we continued for still some time, saw another island. We couldn't make it this time either. And finally, on the 101st day, we saw early in the morning when we woke up an island ahead of us. But we were very near that island, and it was very long indeed, and we were to the windward of this island at a distance of only about 2 miles, so it was impossible for us to sail around it. And we drifted in towards this reef, and you know what those reefs look like on the windward side of an atoll. They're very strong breakers. And we drifted in toward the reef, and eventually we were engulfed by these waves that broke over the raft. But the raft is flat, so it was gradually pushed up on the reef, and after, I don't know, 20 minutes, half an hour, we could step down on the reef flat and wade ashore to the nearest little island. And we had made the trip. We were safe, and we had also managed to salvage most of our equipment.
And there was the island of Raroia.
That was the island of Raroia, the windward side, where of course there's no village. The village is on the opposite side of the lagoon. The distance is about 14 kilometers. So the people living over in that village, about 100 persons, of course they didn't see us. All they could see was a very thin line of coconut trees. But in the evening they saw our campfire. But that rather scared them because, well, they suspect there were some ghosts, you know, rarely tupapao, as we say here. Because no ships ever land on the windward side, and they knew that this island, Little Mutu, was uninhabited. But then cans with the pineapple and other goodies. I think there was some, you know, corned beef, and there was even some chewing gum, some chocolate, cigarettes, all sorts of things that we had in our, you know, boxes, in our storage rooms. They drifted across the lagoon and ended up on the beach in front of the village. And then, of course, they realized that Tupapaos couldn't produce such goods. So they came over to share all these goods with us, and they persuaded us without any difficulty to come over and stay with them in the village. In the meantime, one of our radio operators had sent out a message. It was captured by an amateur in Rarotonga. He informed the local administration here in Tahiti, and the governor decided to send out a schooner to pick us up, and that was a Tamara, you know that schooner. She arrived, well, perhaps 1 week later, and the captain had strict orders to take us and the raft back to Tahiti. And of course, in those days, 1947, there were no foreign yachts or very few ships at all calling. So this was a great event. I mean, Tahiti had been cut off from the rest of the world during the whole war, and everybody was down on the wharf, on the pier to greet us, and we had a marvelous time until a Norwegian vessel, the Thor 1, turned up, and the captain again had orders to take us and the raft back to Norway.
Thank you, Ben, my friend. Thank you very much. Maruru.
Maruru, Maruru.